Alright, looks like I'm live. Just give the YouTube a second to catch up with me. Okay, fantastic. So, welcome to the inaugural Read an Anti-Science Paper Challenge. I think I thought of this thing about 40 minutes ago, so bear with me if we need to work out kinks. But to get us started, let me go ahead and share screen. There we go. So, the procedure for this is simple. You pick a paper or abstract, which I have cleverly hidden with this text file. Hopefully one that's not been done yet. Lucky me. Begin a live stream, but politely ignore the chat until the end, which is step 8. Explain the challenge and procedure, which is what I'm doing right now. Then you'll read the title, author or authors, and journal. So the journal and title. Then read the abstract. At the end of the abstract, name 3 people that you wish to challenge. You may not challenge a person who's directly challenged you. Then, if you have the means and the paper, go ahead and read the remainder of the paper as you wish. And finally, at the end, invite the public to comment. So the goal of this challenge is to highlight what an insular environment practicing poor reasoning yields and bring it from within echo chambers into the light of public debate. So without further ado here, today's paper is titled Mapping the Hobosexual, that's with a B, a Queer Materialism, by Heather Tapley in the journal Sexualities. So, this is also published by Sage Publications, which holds a collection of journals on their website. So, here again, Mapping the Hobosexual, a Queer Materialism, by Heather Tapley at the University of Victoria, Canada, in the journal Sexualities. Here's the abstract. The following article introduces the hobosexual as a concept in queer materialism, mapped at the intersection of not-for-profit hobosex and labor practices historically. The hobosexual collapses the apparent impasse between the material and the symbolic so prevalent in queer studies. The concept represents the redeployment of queer as anti-capitalist practice. Highlighted are the non-normative hobo practices of non-productive expenditure, but also the recognition that these abnormalities are organized by capitalist systems of normalization designed to engender profit. The article also considers the degree to which industrial capitalism affected both hobo mobility and hobo anti-capitalist practice in the 19th century. Generated out of hobo history and queer as anti-capitalist practice, the hobosexual represents resistance to capitalist systems of normalization and enables connections, not necessarily between identities, but between anti-capitalist practices generated out of difference. So, and with the start of the article here, I challenge Sargon of Akkad, Kevin Logan, and Vernaculis. Now I'll continue with the paper for about as long as I can read this. This is the first time through. So, first section, the intervention. In mapping what I call the hobosexual, I am in excellent company. Several scholars of gay male culture have recently connected the American hobo to a history of male same-sex desires and relations. This range of scholarship, while connecting queer sexual practices to the figure of the American hobo, however, tends also to focus less on the hobo as a distinct historical figure and more on same-sex spaces or places of perversity of which the hobo was a part. In mapping the hobosexual, my own intervention into this field takes as its starting point the actual hobo known to have traversed the American landscape from the mid-19th through the early 20th century. For what I have termed the hobosexual is generated out of a historicizing of the hobo. The hobosexual, in other words, does not represent every hobo, but a partial truth of hobo history. I locate the hobosexual in American hobo history specifically at the junction of not-for-profit practices of sexuality and labor and, in the process, generate a queer materialist reading of specific hobo practices. Soon after queer theory became popular in the academy, materialists demanded scholarship that situated queer along the axis of class. The hobosexual has been developed as a particular response to such a request, for the concept is shaped by both a concrete material history of the American hobo and post-structural queer theory. Over a decade ago, Morton critiqued queer scholarship produced by post-structuralists for its primary emphasis on the cultural, radical, and fluid, and called for a focus on material queer, or a concentration on how the pursuit of desire relates for the problems of class, the division of labor, and the exploitation produced by surplus value. Hennessy has since noted the disappearance of class in most academic scholarship in late capitalism, specifically criticizing queer theory for its singular focus on culture ideology and its dismissal of the class dimensions of desire. Sears also promotes a queer Marxist feminism in order to revitalize sexual liberation politics. And most recently, Johnson has recognized the tendency of queer scholarship to reduce capitalism's organizing effects on sexuality to the mere migration of gay and lesbian subjects to urban centers. This inclination results from queer historians not expanding on materialist arguments made by such scholars as D'Amelio, who replaced the static mythology of the eternal homosexual by connecting the emergence of gay and lesbian identity in the 20th century to an economic shift from the rural family to the urban wage laborer in the 19th. In extending D'Amelio's assertion that gay men and lesbians are a product of history, their emergence is associated with the relations of capitalism. Johnson complicates the narratives of urbanization that fuel gay history by arguing that capitalism also produced millions of migrant agricultural and other transitory wage workers at the same time as the gay urban wage worker. In mapping the hobosexual, I extend Johnson's construction of a sprawling queer past inclusive of historical figures not often considered in gay identity politics or history. I also applaud his work for disrupting what Dugan has labeled the homonormative of gay culture, for Johnson's subject of casual workers focuses specifically on poor and working class queers as opposed to the more homogeneous, commodified version of middle class gay identity, of which Dugan, Hennessy, and Morton are critical. Johnson's overall argument, however, is based primarily in the relationship between sexuality and geography. His emphasis on the sex practices of casual workers, and specifically rural locales, interrupts the privileging of the urban over the rural in gay history, and, in the process, challenges what Halberstam has deemed the metronormative of queer narratives. I would also contend, however, that this focus results in scholarship that foregrounds sexual practices amidst a background of materialism. Exploitative practices and historical conditions are noted, but the bulk of the article maps sexual practice as both queer and rural. This privileging of sexuality makes sense in that Johnson is primarily concerned with non-urban same-sex relations and their erasure in traditional gay history. In my mapping of the hobosexual, these sexual relations are crucial as well, but they are connected to the labor practices of a distinct historical figure, that of the American hobo. Johnson collapses all casual laborers, migrant workers, tramps, and hobos, but my mapping the hobosexual requires analyses of both bourgeois discourse regarding the hobo specifically and the concrete material effects resulting from such class discourse. This specificity matters, for it enables a more complex hobo history, one with more agency than that given to casual laborers more generally. Johnson, for instance, employs Anderson's research on hobos to stress that homohemias, urban locales where hobos congregated while in the city, were infused with exploitative businesses run by individuals seeking to capitalize literally on the material deprivations of transient homeless men, but fails to mention one of the spending habits of hobo identity and culture historically was that of splurging the money earned on a job while in the city only to run out of cash and move on to find work again. While Anderson notes that the urban second-hand dealer's profit was made in the coming and going of the hobo, he also acknowledges that the veteran hobo knew how to drive a bargain in this exchange. Johnson is correct, of course. Hobo history, and that of casual laborers more generally, is one of exploitation. Capitalism's inherent uneven development and seismic shifts in economy engendered hobo agency as relative, for sure, but to dismiss this agency entirely is reductive and forecloses an understanding of American hobos as both products and agents of corporate capitalist expansion. What the hobosexual represents is a node of hobo history, a particular site where industrial capitalism's logic of exploitation is confronted by the relative agency of the hobo. Framed by resistance, the hobosexual is not every hobo, but represents temporal anti-capitalist hobo practices and therefore a particular truth of hobo history. The hobosexual signifies the provisional resistance demonstrated by American hobos, a resistance located at the intersection of not-for-profit practices of sex and labor. My employment of the term queer in queer materialism, therefore, is not based in identity politics, but in practice. In this respect, I am obviously influenced by post-Marxist post-structuralists, despite their producing queer desire as primarily cultural and symbolic as well as rooted in transhistorical pleasure. Because the transience of hobo practice is most significant to mapping the hobosexual, readers invested in the polarization of Marxism and post-structural queer may be skeptical of the concept. But while my production of the hobosexual is enabled by the post-structural productions of queer desire as unstable, fleeting and provisional, my focus is also specifically classed. Like many who employ the term queer in scholarship, I look to such a term for its concentration on mismatches between sex, gender, and desire, but understand the triptych of gender, sex, and heterosexuality Butler has mapped and critiqued as particularly bourgeois. My redeployment of queer also differs in designating queer as temporal, not-for-profit practices. The hobosexual, then, if ever considered an identity at all, should be understood as a non-essential identity, as an identity of doing rather than being. And these queer practices, or doing of the hobosexual, are reflective of what Bataille refers to as non-productive expenditure within capitalist regimes. To consume, conserve, acquire, and meet profitable goals in capitalist economies is deemed appropriate and valued behavior, while the practice of expending without a profitable goal is rarely considered a suitable practice when projected onto the working poor or poor classes of which the hobo was a part. The hobosexual represents a queer materialism, but one that accentuates the relationship between class and not-for-profit practices, not class and identity. And while hobo historians occasionally cite hobo connections to labor organizations based in Marxism, I have chosen not to concentrate on this association in mapping the hobosexual. Rather than locate queer materialism in the Marxist rhetoric of, for instance, the industrial workers of the world, with which some hobos were affiliated, I produced the hobosexual as a concept specifically designed to connect unstable and fleeting anti-capitalist practices, not fixed identities, or even fixed practices, and to stress the significance of capitalism's role in determining the mobility associated with such practices. Rather than the property of lesbian, bisexual, and gay history, or the canopy term for lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, transsexual, two-spirited, and others, the term queer, when representative of homosexual practices of non-productive expenditure within capitalist regimes, is not only released from the heterosexual oppositional referent and the heterosexual-homosexual binary, but also speaks to a resistance to the logic of exploitation so central to capitalist enterprise. The hobosexual does not necessarily erase identity, but certainly suspends such, and in the process enables historical connections between queer practices that are anti-capitalist. Queering the American hobo. The American hobo is a productive site for a queer materialist critique in that the term hobo lends itself to both post-structural and class analysis. Hobo, understood by most historians as a specifically classed intermittent white male laborer generated out of mid-19th century industrialization, is also troubled by the term's lack of distinct origin and its various significations. Contemporary historians agree the actual origin of the term is unknown. Tales of its initial source, however, are prolific. Some argue the term originated from the French term hot beau, or from the Latin homo bonus. Other tales of origin claim homeward bound, a response made by Civil War soldiers when asked where they were going after the war was abbreviated to the first two letters of each word, or hobo. The most accepted version of origin, because of its association with labor, begins with the label of hoboy, used to brand migratory farm workers who carried the farm implements, most notably a hoe, as early as the 18th century. Hoboy was then abbreviated to hobo. The term's official documented use in the English language is recorded as 1889 in the Oxford English Dictionary. Soon thereafter, Flint, a journalist who reported on U.S. transients in the late 19th century, used the term in an article in 1891 to signify an aggressive type of work-shunning transient. And, as I will explain briefly later, hobo organizations also partook in the term's slippery etymology by countering definitions such as Flint's. The term's transience in origin and meaning parallels the hobo's erratic sexual and labor practices. My intention in mapping the hobosexual is to queer hobo practices as anti-capitalist. The hobo's sexual actions may represent Johnson's prehistory to gay and lesbian identities, but combined with hobo labor practices, these sexual practices are exposed as influenced extensively by the capitalist regimes in which they transpire. In defining queer as not-for-profit practice, I extend Halperin's understanding that queer represents a resistance to the norm, but I also contend that Western systems of normalization since industrialization have been organized around the exploitation reflective of and inherent in capitalism. While not entirely determining, class certainly inflects homosexual anti-capitalist practices historically. Particular hobo-sex and labor practices represented anti-capitalist practices of non-productive expenditure, but these practices were also a product of industrial capitalism for the pursuit of profit organize these actions extensively, often limiting hobo movement and in turn anti-capitalist practice. In queering the hobosexuality in labor and developing the hobosexual as an identity of doing, the post-structuralist theories of Deleuze and Guattari are significant. I agree with Hennessy that anti-Oedipus glorifies desire by identifying it as the only motor of history, thereby erasing the structures of exploitation on which capitalist production depends. I am, however, still both intrigued and influenced by the theory's resignation of desire as that which does not take as its object person or things, but the entire surroundings that it traverses, the vibrations and flows of every sort to which it is joined, introducing therein breaks and captures an always nomadic desire. Desire, then, is not limited to sexual desire. Desire as always nomadic is released from its distinct location in genitalia, discursive sexuality, and particularly psychoanalysis. Desire as fractured, as consistently rupturing, facilitates its connection to not only various sexual practices, but to practices of labor as well. Deleuze and Guattari's molecular unconscious refers to a process during which misfirings are functional, a site where partial objects are engaged in their own assembly by processes of dispersion that speak to temporalization. Hobosexual practice, understood as molecular, knows nothing of castration because partial objects lack nothing and can therefore form more spontaneous and temporal multiplicities of desire in both sexuality and labor. The molecular's counterpart, or molar aggregate, signifies desire organized by determinate conditions. The relationship between the molecular and molar is one of interdependency. Molecular flows become channeled into molar aggregates, and molar aggregates ruptured into various partialities, and so on. The hobosexual's queer practices in sex and labor are molecular or spontaneous and provisional, while the hobosexual as an identity of doing refers to the molar level, an embodiment of a conscientious resistance to the capitalist management of proper sexuality and labor. Expending without profitable goal, hobosexual practice resists the determinate conditions that manage heteronormativity and the capitalist work ethic. Because the smaller aggregate inherently includes and relies on the molecular and its constant assembling and disassembling, the hobosexual as embodied resistance is always unstable. For Deleuze and Guattari, this unstable subject is engendered by a desire based in pleasure, a desire embodied by what Hennessy critically refers to as the undifferentiated subject of self-enjoyment. The hobosexual, generated out of a working class and poor labor history, however, represents this fragmented subject as a product of class relations. In the selling of his labor, the hobo separated an objectified part of himself to sell on the market, resulting in a non-unified subject. This difference in theorizing the fragmented subject is crucial because it resignifies the queer subject as not only fragmented, but both a product of capitalism and an embodiment of capitalist resistance. Locating the hobosexual at the intersection of queer anti-capitalist sex and work practices accentuates both the temporality and partiality of the molecular, but also recognizes the determinate conditions of capital that affect the degree of movement within the molecular. The instability of the hobosexual at the molar level is an identity of doing, then reflects the instability of capitalism itself. Even Deleuze and Guattari reference the capitalist processes of deterritorialization and reterritorialization, or the liberation of desire that is then consistently reconfigured into different commodity forms to maintain surplus value. Alterations in capitalist production, particularly its busts and booms, gauge the degree to which hobosexual practices occur as well. And it is these market fluctuations that cause the instability of the hobosexual as an embodiment of anti-capitalist practices. In mapping practice desire at the molecular level, these non-specific connections, inclusive disjunctions, nomadic conjunctions, I want to stress the movement, the transience, the nomadic of the American hobo and of hobosexual practices. But I also recognize that it is capitalism that determines the material reality or the degree of such mobility. My focus on historicizing the hobo also differs from Deleuze and Guattari's recurrent reference to the nomad metaphorically. According to Kaplan, the nomad as metaphor erases the material histories of actual nomadic subjects, while Deleuze and Guattari claim to deterritorialize desire from organized sexuality. They actually reterritorialize the nomad as a metaphor for such desire. In mapping the hobosexual, therefore, it is imperative I historicize the American hobo. While the etymology of the term hobo is rather slippery, many hobo historians agree that hobo practices burgeoned after the Civil War. Noted specifically are the hobo practices of intermittent labor and freeload travel on trains. Commentators of the mid-19th century often identified the end of the Civil War as the primary reason for mobile homelessness. Reverend E. Hale in 1877 argued that this particular transient lifestyle was engendered by military life that had produced men who were hardened to life outdoors, used to living off the land, and disposed not to thinking too far into the future. Men who had been removed from their normal context and introduced to the possibilities of extended mobility. With the end of the Civil War, then, came the public recognition of not only homeless men, but men who perpetually moved throughout the nation, and it was the U.S. railroad system that enabled hobos as mobility. As a journalist who rode the rails with hobos once remarked, he could see a transient one day on Fifth Avenue in New York City and a fortnight later in Market Street in San Francisco. Railroad construction boomed with the end of the Civil War. The first transcontinental railroad was completed in 1869, and in that same year, the Central Pacific Railroad connected California to Utah. With this boom in railroad construction, the hobo practices of working sporadically and traveling throughout the nation fit the landscape of excessive production. The hobo is understood as having answered the call of westward expansion, a call for a special kind of labor, a labor remote from family and community life. Considered mobile and adaptable, typically a white man in his 20s and unmarried who had an alleged thirst for moving. The hobo suited the U.S. landscape of industrialization. U.S. expansion westward required a mobile workforce, and hobo practices filled this capitalist need. He worked not only in railroad construction, but also on cattle ranches, in grain fields, in mines, and in orchards. And he arrived at these various jobs most often by riding trains illegally. Hobo labor laid many railroad tracks, but the hobo's most consistent historical connection to the railroads is that of a freeload traveler. Whether in unlocked boxcars, in empty battery boxes, on the cow catchers in front of the engines, in the animal cars, on the brake rods, even in the piles of coal in the coal cars, the hobo rode the rails, crisscrossing the national landscape to take odd jobs and work temporarily, only to move on again. Okay. While trains were used to facilitate traveling to jobs, the illegal riding of rails often disrupted even those plans. Hobos needed to be successful in their ability to catch a particular train. They often missed trains by being unable to catch a boxcar for various reasons, and many lost limbs or perished while trying to board a moving train illegally. Hobo labor practices certainly speak to transients. Indeed, the hobo's practices have been deemed nomadic, but not only because of railway travel. Beating a train, riding the rods, the American hobo represented a mostly disorganized movement across the nation in the mid-19th century and an intermittent labor required of westward expansion. Hobo transience and labor, however, particularly during economic booms, was not solely determined by the capitalist. Hobos were known to quit jobs unexpectedly, not fulfilling contracts for the primary hobo objective was to earn a stake, only to cease working, to often spend frivolously, and to facilitate further movement. DePastino notes that hobos most often transition between various jobs, rarely ever staying at one for more than a few weeks. Not only were hobos known for their high rates of transiency between jobs, but also greater volatility and independence while on the job. Both DePastino and Anderson note that hobos were known to walk off the job because they were easily picked. In other words, an intolerance for exploitative working conditions was a marked feature of hobo labor. Hobo transient labor practices were decidedly anti-capitalist. Hobos used the U.S. railway system not only to transition quickly from job to job, which also facilitated their agency in not completing a contract, but riding the rails also permitted the hobo practice for refusing to work completely and simply riding the rails for the sake of movement and adventure. Although historically cataloged as primarily white and male, the hobo's refusal to adhere to the map of capitalism, stable labor, home, and family, its emphasis on stasis, acquisition, and profit, rendered the hobo deviant in the nation he traversed. Not only was his work ethic considered unstable by employers, but the hobo also rejected exploitative working conditions and, as well, often refused to work. To add to these anti-capitalist practices, the hobo was also known to rebuff the bourgeois practices of accumulation and investment. Very few hobos perceived any reason to accumulate savings or acquire property. The hobo did spend money, but his spending habits, much like his work habits, enabled his non-productive expenditure. According to Anderson, when hobos are in town with money to spend, they go to the limit while it lasts, and then they go out to work again. Going the limit, however, rejected the standard national bourgeois custom of accumulation. When in the city, the hobo may very well have invested in a whole outfit, shoes, suit, and overcoat, only to sell them again in a few days when he was broke. This hobo non-acquisitive ethic caught the attention of middle-class observers who labeled such an anti-capitalist practice as a maladjustment. While bourgeois observers of the hobo may have pathologized such not-for-profit expenditure, hobos themselves considered their conspicuous rejection of acquisitivism to be a positive component of their identity. Industrial capitalism both determined and produced repetitively the systems of normalization that enhanced its profits in the mid-19th century, but the hobo's anti-capitalist practices were not easily managed. Understood both to enhance the profits of the bourgeoisie, in that flexible labor was needed for profit, and threatened bourgeois notions of working-class normality, this required labor was entirely irregular. The hobo appears to have been tolerated for the most part. The hobo's perpetual kinetics, his intermittent work ethic, and his refusal to rest, invest, and accumulate spoke directly to anti-capitalist practices. Regarding travel, work ethic, and consumption, hobo practices were unstable, unpredictable, and difficult to chart. In this respect, hobo practices noted earlier are queered in that they work against the norm, a norm organized by capitalism and reflective of exploitation and the pursuit of profit. But these hobo practices were significantly determined by market conditions also. With the mid-century boom in railroad construction as well as Midwestern harvests, the northeastern lumber yards yet to be predominantly influenced by machinery, the hobo's asocial, homeless lifestyle of wandering and working sporadically fit the national landscape of excessive production. Both Bruns and Dunleavy note, however, that the amount of capital invested in the American railroad system exceeded its imagined surplus value, resulting in company downsizing and collapse. In 1873, J. Cook and Company, the banking and financial agent for the Northern Pacific Railroad, collapsed, and an economic depression materialized. Foreign business had withdrawn from American investments because of a European financial crisis, and the American economy began to crumble, rendering an economic climate where more than 100 financial houses collapsed, business and insurance companies closed, and which saw the end of the railroad boom. Wild speculation in railroads and overexpansion in almost every part of the economy weakened the entire American financial structure. Not only did an estimated 500,000 railroad workers lose their job, but unemployment affected all factory work associated with railroad construction and maintenance, particularly the labor located in the foundries, the rolling mills, and the machine shops. A national unemployment rate of nearly 40% led to droves of men on the road looking for work, and in turn, local and state intervention into what would have then be deemed the tramp question. The same economic shift, in other words, altered the hobo, an embodiment of anti-capitalism tolerated as an exemplar of rugged individualism and a sign of economic growth, to that of the tramp or the economic other in need of labor reform. Hobo practices were now considered part of the tramp class and signaled the end of any bourgeois tolerance for such. No longer was there a significant need for flexible labor, and the hobo, in having to compete for wages, lost much of his mobility and anti-capitalist agency. The American public's preoccupation with the tramp question was extensive, and its emphasis was not only on labor reform, but the labor reform of a regressed species. To give an example, in 1876, Vanderwalker, MD, equates trampism with insanity and a nomadic tendency, representative of regression, or that of primitive man, a modified savagism. Tramps, or those diseased men plagued by the madness of unrest, constitute a regressive resistance to the evolution of the nation. Their latent insanity reveals itself in an irresistible tendency to wander purposeless about. This science of the tramp represents the pervasiveness of social Darwinism in the 19th century, but also exposes the connection between a social theory of evolution and capitalist systems that organize normality. It is the purposelessness of his wandering and non-productive expenditure that allocates the tramp to the lower echelon of the evolutionary scale. Vanderwalker strips the tramp of his capacity to reason and, in effect, relocates this unemployed white male alongside gendered and raced national others. The tramp, then, is feminized for his own apparent lack of the pursuit of profit, the primary purpose of capitalist citizenship. Vanderwalker's discursive production of the tramp is not only a practice in objectification, but also one of spatialization. Constructed as the demasculinized male body, the tramp was prohibited in the national public sphere of employed reasonable men. Cresswell notes that the tramp was most notably a discursive production of the 19th century, particularly in times of economic depression. I argue further that the demasculinization of the tramp, medical research and arguments like Vanderwalker's justified and enabled the violence projected onto the tramp population by not only national and state institutions, but local citizens as well. Because of their unemployment, tramps were considered a national problem able to infect the nation with a lethargy noted as regressive. Their dismissal became the duty of all citizens. Rather than locate massive unemployment as caused by the pursuit of profit, the tramp became the industrial system's scapegoat. The Chicago Tribune in 1877 ran an article that advised its readers to put a little strychnine or arsenic in the meat and other supplies furnished to tramps. In 1895, when the jailing of tramps was troubled by arguments that the unemployed wanderers actually enjoyed being incarcerated during winter months, calls for the whipping post and the return to lash were published as productive measures to purge locales of tramps. A benefit a benefit of whipping was that it would mark the tramp's body, making him known and more visible for containment and dismissal. In an industrial climate of economic decline, these remedies were, while obviously inhumane, were arguably understood as cost-effective and gave citizens a false sense of security that the tramp problem, understood as a disease of epidemic proportions able to infect the nation with non-productive expenditure, could be contained. Yet another form of discipline and spatialization employed during economic decline was the tramp chair designed by Sanford J. Baker of Oakland, Maine. Baker's design consisted of a chair encased in a cage with four wheels and a drawbar. Newcomers to town without proof of employment were forced into the chair, padlocked inside, and then rolled down the main street for public display. This public disciplinary performance ended at the town line, where the tramp was dumped from the chair and told not to return. Additionally, Flint writes of the popular practice of the timber lesson, or clubbing of tramps, as sanctioned by citizens. What is exposed as in historicizing hobo anti-capitalist practices after 1873, then, is the extent to which capitalism, with its economic busts and booms, determines the degree of mobility and agency of its resistors. For the national preoccupation with and production of the tramp as a canopy term for all unemployed wandering citizens limited even the hobo's train travel. Strict vagrancy laws and an increase in railroad police officers during economic depressions also regulated hobo mobility increasingly. A little bit more of this, and I might have to skip a little bit further down. Another increasing result of the tramp scare was the bourgeois preoccupation with the sexuality of the wandering class. Johnson notes that social reformers and government agents began explicitly associating casual and seasonal laborers with sexual perversion. And Foucault argues that conflicts were necessary before the exploited class were granted a body and a sexuality, that the deployment of sexuality did not operate in a symmetrical fashion with respect to social classes. Technologies of sexuality emanated from narratives fueled by bourgeois self-interest, but he also notes that there is a bourgeois sexuality and that there are class sexualities. Or rather, that sexuality is originally historically bourgeois in that in its successive shifts and transpositions, it induces specific class effects. The hobosexual consists of one of these class effects, for capitalism gauged the tramp hobo's non-productive expenditure in labor and in turn limited his transient sexual practices. Likewise, the wealth of research regarding the tramp or hobo's non-productive sexual expenditure was published after 1873. Anderson states that the tramp hobo's sex relations were naturally illicit. Not a marrying man, the hobo had few ideal associations with women and found the only accessible women were prostitutes. The sociologist adds that the majority of hobos were as transient in their attachments to women as their jobs. The predominant form of hobo heterosexuality was then a non-productive expenditure based on sexual desire, was typically anonymous, and most often represented a spontaneous encounter between various bodies in multiple locations. The hobo may very well have intended to buy sex from a prostitute, may very well have known on which street sex workers gathered, but like most urban aggregates, the stability of these city spaces was consistently disrupted by the exchange of various subjects and bodies. As opposed to the investment, repetition, and stability associated with personal intimacy, these sexual practices represent a form of anonymous urban sex and the act of expending without profitable goal. The hobo's sexual encounters with multiple prostitutes over a period of time and in various places signify sexual practices that move against the bourgeois production of status, marriage, procreation, and the conflation of sex and love. Okay, I'm going to skip down further. Rather amazed I made it this far. Oh, there we go. The hobosexual. We'll start there. I think we're getting close to the end. The hobosexual. What I have labeled the hobosexual materializes at this intersection of labor, sexuality, and class in the 19th and early 20th centuries. Rather than simply recognizing that the hobosexuality, notably same-sex, intergenerational, and commodified, represents a prehistory of gay and lesbian identity, I connect the hobosexual expenditure and intermittent work practices in order to show how one inflects the other, how class functions in relation to queer desire, how the pursuit of particular desires relates to class. My argument is not that class determines sexuality, nor that sexuality determines class, but that the degree of homosexual agency is determined primarily by the ability to move, and it is capitalist markets that determine this mobility overwhelmingly. In mapping the logic of capitalism, the division of labor, the exploitation needed to engender surplus value, as a logic that organizes systems of normalization, my employment of the queer and queer materialism is decidedly anti-capitalist. Located at the junction of non-productive expenditure and work and sex practice, the hobosexual represents a partial truth of American hobo history, or an identity of doing that encompasses the hobo's conscientious rejection of the pursuit of profit, a dismissal of the emphasis on bourgeois stability and accumulation historically. I think that's going to do it for me. I just don't think I can read any more in a straight manner. This paper, of course, was brought to you by Heather Tapley, who is an assistant professor in the Women's Studies Department at the University of Victoria, Canada. She has published articles on gender, race, and sexuality and their relationship to class in Torquay Atlantis, Journal of Lesbian Studies, and Canadian Review of American Studies. Tapley is currently researching the hobosexual history of the 19th century burlesque woman. Okay, I think that's more than enough of that. So, what I'll do now is hand out the Hangout link into the chat, which I've also unfortunately been neglecting. So now I see you guys, and I see that you probably were about as happy as I was on this. So there's the Hangout link. Feel free to hop on in. And I'll give it a few minutes. Wow, it is really raining out. Well, in the meantime, for the, 3 people minus me, 2 people watching, any questions from the chat?
Did I wrong you in another life, Craig?
Yes, you did.
Okay. So we're even now. Worst use of Marxist dialectic ever. I am an expert in these things. I am a political scientist.
No, you're a Hillary supporter. It's even better.
Even better, right? Yeah, so I should know all about Marxism, of course.
I mean, have you received your woman card yet?
It's in the mail along with my decoder ring.
Yeah, so sorry for the piss poor reading. I was having a real hard time not laughing my ass out.
Oh, I could tell. Wow.
I'll just not think about it now.
TLDR, capitalism caused faggotry.
Well, this is why I said in the challenge thing to just stop reading after the abstract and challenge other people, because I have a feeling that for some papers that might be as far as you can get without killing someone or laughing.
Yeah, or bashing your own head in for...
I promised myself I'd make it through the whole fucking thing, and this is what happens.
Nope. No.
But that's why I challenged 3 people who are as or more pedantic than I am.
So, Okay, what's the goal here from like, the evil SJW agenda? From what
No,
I see,
that is a subcategory at best. It doesn't have to be this. Like, this was just freaking obvious, and I found it exceedingly hilarious.
tying Marxist dialectic
How
to
often
fucking
they
queer
say
theory.
hobosexual in this, and then they just repeat the same sentence right afterwards every fucking time.
Yeah. I was all like, "Oh, Sokol generator."
Yeah, no, this is a real paper.
Yeah.
That's the worst part, is it's a real paper. And let's not forget, in the journal, Sexualities. So when you think sexualities, think hobosexual.
Right. It's a new one. Oh my god. And of course, only just taking out a chunk of history, and because.
Well, let me go ahead and give you a preview of what I wanted to read next. Sorry, go ahead.
Oh my god. Oh, okay. I was just saying, it's just more. The world didn't exist until evil capitalism. It's like there were never transients. Like when you were talking,
there were no people who made sequential poor decisions.
It was
like trying to read this whole thing.
It was actually a position in
life.
The best part is even romanticized, talked about, and all that foul treatment of chasing transients out.
The best part there is that there is this expectation that people in this position were conscientiously resisting capitalism as they fucked around.
No.
Yeah,
not necessarily poor decisions. Like the thing about the veterans, they were like, "Fuck it, I'm just gonna like travel around." And did hit on the one thing that being.
But were they all thinking, "Gee, what a bourgeois thing to settle down"?
No,
I should go and resist capitalism on this train.
Yeah, because every Union and Confederate soldier was steeped
and better
in
yet,
Marxist,
that's a sexuality.
In dialectical materialism as part of their training.
Better yet, this is a sexuality.
Right.
Not like this. I mean, I understand that a sexuality can be a classification of a behavior, but no.
Yeah. But what's the term? There's actually circumstantial homosexuality too.
Was that hobo or homo?
Homosexuality. No, hobosexuality. Sorry. I gotta correct the. Oh, I was using the wrong dialectic. Sorry. Oh, God, kill me.
No. What we need to do is take you back to the re-education center so you can correct your enunciation.
Right.
You capitalist pig dog.
Oh, my God. This fucking postmodernist, quasi-fucking Marxist dialectic bullshit.
It's brilliant.
And it's fucking brilliant, actually, in its way, because it does.
Well,
it does.
I would write this to piss people off. Like, if I really hated somebody and I knew that they would, like, just approve this, I would put this through, and then I would tell them it was all bullshit.
This woman really hates humanity, and she's going to punish everyone that she can.
Well, this shit's getting published. This is a peer-reviewed journal.
Yeah.
Like, someone...
What's the journal?
The journal is Sexualities. And before you say anything, they do
this quasi-Marxist claptrap into a journal.
They do profess to publish social science articles.
Yeah, I get it.
So, I mean, this is what's appearing in a social science journal called Sexualities.
Oh,
queer materialism through the homosexual.
Trying to sneak in this postmodernist. God,
they didn't sneak it in. They peer-reviewed it in.
Yeah, I saw it. I guess you got to present all points of view.
Well, let's go down to the. I think I saw something as I was skipping by here. Let's go down to the references area. Oh, look, I see Marx.
Duh.
This is from Anderson, noting something about the industrial workers of the world, which would be Marxist.
Nope. Actually, nope. My Gramps was wobbly. They're a narco syndicalist. So get it right. Anarcho-syndicalists aren't Marxists.
Well, there's nothing specified either way, but for whatever reason, there's this reliance on the IWW for some kind of context of Marxism.
Well, which is
it has
weird
today.
because syndicalists are not Marxists. They're communists. You can call them communists, but they're like, simply put, syndicalism is going to the communist part, i.e., the workers owning the means of production without that whole socialist state dictatorship of the proletariat in between. Ground up communism. Worker owned and operated.
Sure. All they have to do is become queer.
All they got to do is engage in their little faggotry, and then bing, bam, boom. Anarcho.
Just the part I almost couldn't get through the part where they were saying molecular and molar. That
I noticed that too. They tried. Oh, better get some sciencey terms here. Molecular.
I mean, on a word count basis, this is a pretty good paper, I guess. But I guess they were trying to boost the average word length. Holy fuck! But yeah, just to preview you.
Seriously.
Yeah, there it is. Just to preview you for what I plan on doing next time. I don't know when the hell that's going to be, by the way. Glaciers, unless someone beats me to it.
Oh, no. This was a while ago. I heard about this.
Yeah, but it is worth reading in its entirety. It happened to come up again today. I saw that he apparently defended himself when interviewed by, I think it was by Science Mag. They interviewed him, and he doubled down on.
Oh yeah.
On feminist glaciology, yes. It's.
I know.
Suffice to say, this one was should have happened a while ago.
Just that should set off. That should. I saw it in there. You just scroll by gendered science.
Yep. Yeah, this is not being read today though, not by me. So, just again for those who have tortured themselves and made it to this point, since there's only 2 people watching, which I'm pretty well convinced is just the 2 of us.
Yeah, pretty much.
For whoever managed to tough it out to this point, see if you can get Sargon of Akkad, Kevin Logan, or Vernaculis to read anything like this. And it doesn't have to involve feminism, doesn't have to involve gender studies.
Oh, there's plenty of shit papers.
There's a lot of, yeah. The more pernicious ones are the ones who really do profess to be science. Things like Andrew Wakefield's autism connection to vaccination. Yeah. Things like that, too. Those count as well. But still, just reading this shit out so that people hear or engage somewhat. Like I said, you can get through the abstract if you don't have the means to buy the articles. It's actually probably better because it shortens things up so that you can get participation.
If you happen to get the copy of the study from someone else and you read it, will you get in trouble?
No.
Okay.
So here's the thing. This distinctly counts as fair use.
Okay.
So should you end up doing something with this and you get a DMCA or what have you, this is distinctly a transformative this is a transformative work. So the nature of the work is transformative. It is not for any kind of competitive gain in the same market. So as far as whether or not you're trying to make money off of it, ads on your videos don't matter in this case. It is not the same medium. This is spoken and visual. There's also the criticism aspect of it. So for critique and commentary, you're absolutely allowed to republish a work.
Okay. I would
think
so.
There are, if you satisfy all 4 of the factors for this just by reading it on air. I mean, you don't even have to do significant critique at the end. So it has been shown. I don't have the case memorized right now, but I can go find it if anyone really
I could
gives a
hear
shit.
it because I could hear echoes because I just was studying fucking Marx, but it has so many holes in it. It's
Oh,
like
yeah.
they're just tossing in
I was just
chunks
going to
of
say,
it.
like, there's a case. I can't remember the exact case, but I can find it if someone wants me to, for republishing the entirety of a work untouched, specifically for the purpose of commentary and critique. So wholesale copying of a work is still possible in that
Yeah,
sense.
if you're
So if someone
providing commentary,
if someone decides to start browbeating you on this subject matter, they're dead wrong. Like, it's been
yeah,
settled in the Supreme Court, kind of dead wrong.
yeah. Well, it's a transformative work.
Yeah,
Even
I
if
mean,
you go
just
through the whole damn thing sentence
like I
by
said,
sentence.
all
Yeah,
all all four factors are satisfied just by reading it out.
yeah. But good lord.
Oh, Axis, you're in the chat. What's up?
Yeah, kind of ignored the chat there.
Yeah, well, I said I was going to, and I hit it. Actually, I didn't see what people were saying. Oh, fucking hell. Oh, you jumped the shark, man. This isn't Sokol.
I was just commenting. It just sounds. I know that it wasn't because you. But god damn, it sure does sound like somebody used the Sokol generator.
Oh, I mean, the better article to read, but, unfortunately, it's a sound scientific piece, so I can't really do that for this challenge, would have been the chicken article.
The chicken article.
Yeah. As entitled Chicken, Chicken, Chicken. Okay, well, I think this is, unfortunately, due to the nature of the content earlier, I think this stream is effectively deadpanned.
Yeah.
So I don't know if
Now
you
I
had
got
some other
nothing
kind of
else.
comment. Yeah.
I spurred on the fucking worst Marxism ever. That's pretty much Marxist dialectic application ever. That's all I had. Pretty much. I could make commentary on her fucking distortion of history, but meh.
I'm just reading some of the comments.
It's actually some of the I've seen worse. But I've seen a lot better.
Oh shit, he's exposing the social systems of Darwinism in the 17th century. Getting my cock out.
Ah. What?
Oh man. Okay.
All right, man.
All right. Yeah, I think we'll go ahead and I'll just stop broadcast now. Thanks for
All right.
coming on. And
Yeah, man.
if you made it this far, thanks for watching.
Oh God. Hell.